detailedly we discussed about the complete architecture, how the services are configured and used. One simple example I showed you, right? So the architecture, what is the service, how the service works, this is complete information about services. Now we will see how we can create a service, configure the service use in our application. One simple example we will see how to work with it. Technically, already yesterday I detailedly explained how to add services and configure. So let's create a service here. So for example, so I am adding a component here. I am adding a service here. So let's add one component here first. Yeah, already I have some login component. I think some login design is there. Already some login component is there. Okay, so if the login component is there, I will keep this in the startup. I will start with the login component. Okay, earlier in the initial stages we designed that app login. So we have a login component. Okay, let's open and run this login here, localhost. Yeah, this is the login component. We have just a login component. It is initially having a simple login screen. Actually, in this login screen, the login component, let's go to the login component.html. Here are the button. I will just add a div. So class as group. And here we will define a label verify code. And just we are defining a div. And here we need to just display some code. We need to display some code. Actually, we have input type is equal to text and class as form control. And below that, we have a div. Okay. In that, we will keep some options, right? Verify code, how we can manage. So you can see the design, we have verify code like this. Now, important is, yeah, just the verify code option is fine. Now, I want some random code to be generated here. Just like capture, some random code to be generated here. And I want that in every form. So in every form that you create in Angular, so registration form, login form, everywhere I want the code verification. Then we cannot write for every form. Then what we will do is, we will add a service. I am creating so a new folder in the app. In the app, I'm creating a new folder. Custom services. Custom services is the folder. In the custom services folder, I'm adding a new file. So the name capture.service.ts, capture.service.cs. You can give any name. So this is capture service.ts. In the custom services, we have capture service. And how do we design it as a service? Yesterday, we discussed what we need for a service. So we are creating export class. So capture service, that is the class. Okay. And what this capture service class, it should behave as a service. So to make it as a service, we need from Angular core, Angular/core. So we need injectable. We need injectable. And we use an injectable marker. And to represent a singleton pattern, so we have to define provided in root. We are configuring provided in root. What is that? Already I explained. Yesterday we discussed so much about providers and what is that provided in. Now this is a service, and service have a method. So as a method, service is having a method, generate code. Generate code is a method which should generate a random code and return that random code. So service can contain several methods. So I am configuring a method for the service, generate code, and it is having a is equal to math.random. It generates a random number. Usually random number, math is a predefined function which generates random number. And usually random number actually starts with 0.776 like that. So then we want an integer, then we will multiply by 10. Similarly, I'm generating random numbers here. I'm generating all the random numbers. So we have B, we have C, and we have D, E, F. Okay, some 6 random numbers are there. All are generating a random number, and we will concatenate this in a code. Code is equal to, it will use this random number. And in the random number, we don't want any fractions. Then what we do is math.round. Round will round the number A. Similarly, all others also. So copy with a space. So round B. Okay, another one. And that is C. And another one, that is D. And E. And F. So this is a random number combination, a string representation. And I want to return this code. So the code is returned here. That means whenever you call generate code, this generate code is going to return this code that contains a random number. We just return some logic for generating a random number and return that random number. Okay, so that is generate code method in the capture service. I want to use this service in the login component. Then we need to inject into login component TS. So in order to inject into login component.ts, here we are defining. So in the login component, First, we need to get that service actually. Usually we have to import. So import from, and we need to get from. So custom services. So it should get out of the current folder, and from there custom services. In the custom services, capture service, we need to import. From there, we need to get a capture service. Capture service is the class we need to import. We need to inject that at the time of instantiating of the class. Then we need to define a constructor, and into the constructor, yesterday we discussed it. So we will create a private. Why private? I told you, capture, and it is of type capture service. Why we write like this? Yesterday we discussed all that concept, right? What happens if I don't give an access modifier also? We discussed about that. Now, what should happen is very simple, is we will create a property. So public code, and this code should get information from this dot capture dot generate code method. Generate code method will generate a random code. That random code is stored in this code. This code we will display. We will display that code here, somewhere here. Verify code, and I will keep a div, and here I want that code to display, and you can see there a random code will come. You can see a code is displayed here. What I will do is, just beside that code, I will add a button. So a button, and in the button I will keep a span. So class as FA, and FA some refresh. So FA refresh, some option is there. And that is the button. As I think FA refresh is not there, so I will just keep this as FA sync or asynchronous is there, some symbol. It will get some symbol and display there. Okay, we have this one. Now what should happen here is, usually what should happen is, when I click on this button, so I will, if I give the class as BTN usually, then usually the button class will keep in a like this. Now what we need to do is, when user clicks on that, I need to generate a new code here. See, it depends on completely how you write the logic. So what should happen here is, so we need to get another method as refresh, public refresh click. So on refresh click, I want this code to get the code again. That means this dot capture is the service object, generate code. Whenever user clicks refresh, it should generate this code again. Okay, and refresh click should happen when user clicks the button. On click, we will call a refresh click, and you can see now. So this is, I click this refresh button, and a random code should be generated and displayed there, right? So that is refresh click, and some problem. What happened? The code is updated with yeah, save this all. Yeah, the code is updated on the refresh click. We need to call that function. Okay. Now on click, you can see that the random code is generated and the random code is displayed there. I click the refresh button and the random code is generated here. Now, actually, how user will verify this code with whatever user enters in this text box, that you can write, because whatever user enters here in the text box, you can collect and you can compare with alert saying that so incorrect code. That's our wish. How you want to implement the logic, that your wish. You can write in any way. So this is the basic approach of how we can create a service. Now, what is advantage here? Now, what is the point here actually? So the point is simple, like the point is nothing but, so we are creating so that we can consume and use in any location. So that is the basic of configuring the service. That is one example. So that means instead of rewriting the functionality every time, we can reuse the functionality. So for that, this is the approach how we follow. And another important is actually this service, you observe carefully here. This service is provided in the root. I'm not providing this into the root. I'm not providing in the root. So service is not provided in the root. That means actually from where to get the data for that particular service is not defined. That means injector is there, but provider is not defined. That means we are not defining any provider. Actually, we don't need that provider. And when we are not giving the provider, you saw some error here. We don't need that provider. How we resolve it, I will tell you. When I inspect this, you can see that. So in the errors, you can see. So in the console, let's open that in the console. So let's reduce the size here for this, okay? Yeah, so that is a normal option there, right? So we don't need any responsive, right? Fine. Now you can observe here in this console, you can see that it says that, so it says that null injector error. You can see null injector error, and you can observe that it says that there is no provider for capture service. No provider for capture service. Yeah, this is what it is exhibiting, dependency injection mechanism actually. That means now the dependency is not identified. Provider will identify the dependency, and currently dependency is not ever identified. It's okay. What you can do is you can configure the dependencies not in this service. Actually, you can configure the dependency in your module. What you can do is in the app module, we have providers. In app module providers, this is the root providers. In the root providers, we can include that captcha service. We can include that captcha service. It is injecting that captcha service here. You can see that captcha service. So from in the providers of module, we are configuring it. Now, when I save this in the providers, we mentioned it. And you can see that now here it is working fine. Now you can see that it is working fine. That means, so it is working fine. It is working fine. That means the service is working because the provider is configured at the module level. This is for the root of application. So instead of doing this, if I don't do this, usually it shows an error. That means usually it will display an error. So the error says that is. So you can configure the provider in the service. You can just define here. So provided in, so root, provided in root. And you don't need to define in the modules, app module. Then you can see that it is working fine now. So that means it is working normal as usual. This is actually the concept of provided. So the concept of provider that already we discussed in the last session. You can configure the provider here, or you can define directly the provided in. Yesterday, I clearly explained what is a provider, how many types of providers are there, how to define the provider. So this defines the dependencies. This uses the dependency injection. That means whenever you define provided in, it will identify its dependency, gets the dependencies and injects the dependencies into your component. If you are not configuring this here, then no problem. At the module level, you can define it. At the module level, you can define it. But very important is, if you are configuring here, then it represents singleton mechanism. When you are configuring here, it represents singleton mechanism. This is singleton mechanism. Then which one is better? So this represents singleton. Then which one is better? Which one is better? This is singleton. This represents singleton. That means if you are writing the provided in, that means it is creating an instance. Through that instance it is accessing. So this is singleton. So in many interviews they ask that without singleton mechanism, can we use a service? The main intention of service is singleton. Without singleton also we can use a service. Without singleton also we can use a service, right? So then we have to define the service provider in the module level, at the module level. But service is intended to use with singleton mechanism. So right, that is the main intention. That is the reason. So this is better. This is better. So this is actually good for dealing with, services, right? So that is two important options. So here, before this, I will give you one more point here. So service uses singleton pattern. Service uses singleton pattern when configured with provider in the service marker defined in the service marker. Service uses a singleton pattern when it is defined in the service marker. That is what actually the service marker is. So this is the service marker. That means you can define injectable, and example is this one. That is how we configure the injectable. And important is, so service can be implemented. So without singleton. So by configuring in the app module, app.module.ts providers, in the app module providers. So we can configure in this. So that means here what we have to do is, so we have to go to app module providers. In the providers, we need to add that. So in the providers, we need to define that. In the providers, we need to define the service name. We need to configure that. So the services that you want to use, so which one is better? So that is singleton mechanism is always better, right? That is why we are using services actually. Then you may ask, like, then why they have given the other method? That is for factory techniques. If you want to use a factory technique, so then you can go with that mechanism. But we are coming here to handle so the mechanism of singleton instead of using the factory techniques. That is the reason this will be the better option. And important is, so when you defined service in providers of app module.ts, so you can configure your service. So without provided in, you can configure your service without provided in. That you can manage, that you can do. It doesn't require that provided in if you are dealing with the service at this level. So technically, this is one complete example. What we have done in this example is first create a new folder in app folder. Create a new folder by name custom services. Create a new folder by name custom services and add into app folder. Okay. Second, add a new file. You have to add a new file, and that file will be just like service.ts. Already we know that service.cs service is not an extension, it is just a tradition for services. And in that, we need to inject this functionality. We need to configure all this functionality. We need to define all this functionality. So we need to configure all that functionality, right? So I'm adding all that functionality here. That is the functionality here, right? Now, important is, so when you configure this, right? So let's remove all this, fine. Okay, so when you add this is the captcha service. Okay, fine. Now, after configuring this captcha service, we need to inject this into any component. We need to inject that service into any component. So in the next step, we have to add, you have any login component, and in the login component, so you can create a login component, login.component.ts. In the login component TS, we need to inject that service. So that is how we generally inject. And what is the complete process of injecting and why we write in a constructor? These are all things we discussed already. So we need to inject that into it. After that, we need to use it in that. So login.component.html. We need to just use it. So we need to just use it. So just we are configuring the HTML. We need to just use it. I'm just adding that here. We can use that, right? So we just add that and we need to use that here. So let's use, that means just what we have to do is we need to get that code and assign this return value into that code and refresh that code whenever the refresh button is clicked. That is only the basic approach that you need to follow. And this is all the logic for that. That is all the logic. So here it's a very simple one, right? So just we created a service. You can use this for different purpose, for different situations. So suppose you are working with some data. So generally what we do, that we will see in next level. So we will see in the next level how to use the service for interacting with the data, working with the data. Actually what we do is, suppose we have a database, some Oracle, MySQL or MongoDB, some databases are there. We have some server side technologies like .NET, like JSP, like PHP. So Python, some node like this. Important is by using these technologies, we write the logic to communicate with the database, get the data from the database. Actually, what we do is we create APIs, we create services. So these are APIs and web services. Generally, we create API, web services and all, right? And by using server-side technologies, we configure all this, right? Now, what we need to do is, so these APIs will perform operations like, so get some data, some post some data, some put some data, that means modify the data. So delete some data, all these are defined inside this. Now, generally, I need to handle this in the Angular application now. Angular application. Usually what that complete architecture I will show you later. Then what we do is in Angular application, there are so many components. We have products components, you have categories components. So we have list components, we have details components, we have create components, we have edit, we have delete, so many are there. Now everywhere, suppose in all these products, categories, list, details, in all these, we need to get the data and show the data. Then for every component, we will not write a logic for that. Then what we do is we create a service. So this is an Angular service. We create an Angular service. This service, so we'll have the methods, get methods, post methods, put methods and all. And they will use these methods to interact with the APIs. And API will use this server-side technology, interact with the database. And these will be injected into categories, into products. So these will be injected into categories, into products, into list, into details, everything. That means in every component, we can access the data. We can handle the data. And in every component, we don't need to define the data. We do that in a service and we inject into every component. This type of approach is very commonly used. In our next levels, we will see that. For that, we need to first learn how to communicate with the server-side APIs, how to get the data from the database. For that, you need some server-side technologies, some server-side technologies. Then you can manage that. That I will show you how we can do. We will discuss about that. But initially, so we just created a service for reusing a functionality. Later, we will use this service for handling different types of interactions, right? Different types of interactions. So technically, this is very complex architecture. This is very complex. So end to end, how everything works. We will see that. One example, I will explain how to manage that. So the point is, services are not just like these type of functionalities just you have seen. They can do more, mostly like getting the data, interacting the data, working with the data. Such examples I will show you in later concept, how to work with that. Initially also we can try. For example, suppose see here, we already worked with a lot of components. Suppose you see we have a component like filtering, sorting, searching, so many products catalog, products filter. Actually, it contains the data. This is the data. This is the data. Here directly we are having the data and we are using the data actually. Let's keep this products catalog in the startup and see what we designed actually. Products catalog. So catalog. Okay. Let's keep this products catalog here and see what we designed actually. Catalog. Okay. So the products catalog. Fine. Now you can see the products catalog actually contains the data coming in and displaying. This is the data. So this is all the data. We have some data and we are working with some data, right? The products. We need several locations where we are dealing with the data, means products. So that means not only in this module, so in this component, several locations we need this. Then we don't hard code that in this way. Later we can bring from database, that we will see later. Initially, this products is empty. That means this products is empty. Products collection is empty. I will copy this temporarily. I will keep this here. Yeah. And here I will just remove all this. So that means the products array is empty. So we don't have any products, empty. Obviously, you can see that the output, so it is empty. That means we don't have any products information to display there. It is empty, nothing is there. So all zero. So we don't have data here. And we don't want to hard code the data because we need the same data across several components. Then usually what we do, technically what we do here is generally, we will create a service now. How we can create a service? That means another example, a service for providing data to various components. This time we will see a different approach. What we will do is open the terminal, open app folder in terminal and run the following command. You have to run the following command. What is the command you have to run? The command is ng generate service and the service name data service. So skip test like this. We are creating a data service. Okay, so what we will do is we will open this app in the integrated terminal. Okay, and here we will generate a service now. We will generate a service. Actually, when you are generating the service, you can generate all your service in a separate location. So you have custom services. You can generate a service in the custom services folder. That will be better. All your services can be kept at one place. So then what I will do here is open custom services. So custom services folder in terminal. So you have to open that custom services folder in terminal and generate a service, ng generate service. You can use shortcut yes service, right? So ng generate service. So data and skip test. So skip test. I'm just giving data.skip test. Okay, data skip test. A data service is generated for you. So this is a service generated for you. So let's go here and you see the custom services. In that a data service is there. This is the data service. Already injectable provider, everything is configured in the data service. Here I will just create in this data service, I will create a simple. So get products method. In the latest versions, you don't need to even define the access modifier for that. So you don't need to define access modifier for that until or unless you need certain restriction, actually private. So because by default, it will be considered as public actually. So you can access through public. But it is always good to define the access modifier because you are trying to access outside this scope. In that is very important, right? Okay. Now in this we are returning. This get products should return an array. It should return an array. That array contains a collection of products. Later, here you will write the logic that connects with an API, gets the data from API and returns the data coming from API. As of now, we are directly returning the data. So I have already data, copy its location, this array. I will copy it and I will paste the data here. So this is the data. Fine. That means get products is a service method, which returns this data when it is present in a data service. So now I want to use this for our products catalog. Products catalog is not having any data. We want the data there. Then what we can do, so we can go to the products catalog. In the products catalog, we can inject the service. So into the constructor, we are injecting the service. So private and data, and it is coming from data service. It is injected from data service. It is injected from the data service. Okay. Now, what these products should have is very important here. We can write in several ways. Generally, constructor is accessing it. Okay. And now, by default, you can bind the data. That means here we are writing. So on changes. So that means ng on changes. But for that, we need to implement ng on changes. Here we need to implement. So this implements ng on changes. So ng on changes. So for that, we need to first import that ng on changes. So that means here we have to define. So on changes, we are configuring on changes. And this implements on changes, And in that case, we have to configure. So on changes, what should happen on changes? That means here we have to define So ng on changes, ng on changes. This dot products is an array. It should get this dot data. It will get the data from get products method and it will bind the data to that products. It will bind the data to that products. So on changes, it should happen. That means you know when to bind the data. That is important. So on changes, it is binding the data. That means it has to get the data and bind the data and display the data here. But important is ng on changes is usually binding to the property and getting the data. This is where you will find the other options. Actually, data is already there. Data is already there. And data is coming from a service and that is already injected into this particular class. Now, what we need to just do here is whatever the data is injected into this particular class, we need to use the data. Actually, you learned that this is the first phase actually, that is binding the properties and with values. So, but this is not a value. Actually, the value should be, it is initialized in the memory. From the memory initialization, we need to get the value. We need to get the value. That means from the initialized memory, we need to access the values and use the value. So that means we're not directly defining any value. So if we are directly defining the value, on changes will directly define the value. See here, data is not coming here. Let's inspect here. Let's inspect here. And it is not showing any error also. It is not showing any error because that is not a problem. The problem is nothing but here data is not directly provided. Data is to be initialized and accessed from the memory. Then which phase is for initializing the data? Which phase is used for initializing the data? Usually, what is the phase? Actually, I can directly apply. I'm just showing the event, which is for initializing the data. That means what we have to do is we have to configure this implements. So on init, this implements on init, and on init. That means I am not configuring anything on changes. I am defining ng on init, So we have to assign that data and display the data. I'm not defining on changes. On init, I'm configuring that. That means I'm accessing the data and defining the data. So here on initialization, you are defining the data. Now you can see the data comes in. This is the important option to understand. This is the important option to understand the concept of events, right? In which phase the data is initialized into memory and in which phase we have to get the data from the memory and bind the data. If data is directly provided, on changes is okay. But if data is coming from the memory, it is in the memory, it is in the cache injected by our service. Then usually you learn that generally binding is happened by using this method. But we already learned one more point that on initialization, the data will be in the memory. From there, we can access the data and bind to the properties. So that means data need to be initialized, then it should be binded. All other options here are showing problem because all these need to be accessed. All these need to be accessed and they need to be displayed. They need to be displayed on initialization only actually. On initialization only, all these need to be accessed and defined. All these need to be accessed and defined. Then others we need to customize according to them. Others we need to customize. I'm not disturbing that here temporarily. I'm not disturbing that. I will just keep that in that way. I am just showing you the basic of how we can inject some data and accessing. Because this is a complete different example. Here we are using our custom events, event emitters and all other options also. So this is our main intention, is that wherever you need data now, then you can inject the data. But the injected data is in the memory. From the memory, initialized memory, we have to get the data and store in the local reference. This need to be binded and sent to the UI. That is done on changes, Initially, so this is what we need to follow. So how we can configure and use, right? This will be more useful in later stage when you learn how to handle data coming from database actually. That means we will not directly define the data here. We will not directly define the data here. Actually, we will pull the data from an API by using a server-side technology, and we configure the data. Right? That's what actually the service happens and how it actually works. Right? So in this example, in the data service, what we have done is, so a service is generated here. A service is generated here. And here we are configuring. In the service, we are just defining one option like, yeah. So what is that option is? So go to data service, data service, right? Service name I will just give as data. Okay, data. And now we need to add the file here. So the file is data.service.ts. In the data service, so we need to define this one. This is the logic. Temporarily, for working with the data, I am giving one example. This is the data. Now we want to inject and use in any component. Then what you have to do is, so go to products component. Any component you create, products component, and inject that into this. So how we can inject? So we have products.component.ts. In this, we need to inject it. So I'm not giving the entire point, just only the basic here. We need to first import the data service. So we need to first import the data service here. Okay. And after importing the data service, we need to implement this. We don't need on changes to configure. So we will define on init. So another one, you need to import this one also, that is events. And in your component, so we are implementing both of them, but we are configuring on init. The data gets on init and display the data, right? This is the basic one, right? That's a simple option here. So here I will just give a note, right? You cannot bind the data for products as it is accessed from accessed by provider. So from cache. So that is the reason you cannot bind the data for products. So you cannot, right? Yeah, you cannot bind the data for products here. You can do that on initialization because it is initialized into the memory. From there, you can access and use it. That is the basic approach of how do we use service. What you are going to learn in the future is you are going to write a service which can get this data from a database using a server-side technology and provide data to you. That means even you will not have any hard-coded data here. Everything will come from a database. But for that, we need server-side integrations and all. So this is how we can manage the services, how we can deal with the services in Angular. Some examples we have seen how we can work with the services. Next, after understanding the services, now we need to go into another important, because you cannot work with server-side technologies or interaction with APIs until or unless you know about Angular forms. So another important concept in Angular is to understand about the forms. Now, some important changes are there in the new versions. Now, some more information you need to know about Angular forms, how to deal with them. Actually, technically, we know that form. So we know technically that usually form is a container. Form is a container that comprises of set of set of elements which allow interaction with our application, which allow interaction with our application. So form is actually a container. So that means actually form provides an UI. Usually form provides an UI. So from where user can input, user can edit, user can delete, user can view data. So user can perform various types of interactions with the data. Usually we know that HTML form comprises of elements like button, like text box, like checkbox, like radio, like list box, etc. So many are there. We know that it is a combination of so many. Actually, Angular, what it will do is Angular makes the static HTML form into dynamic. It will make the static HTML form into dynamic. That means HTML presents the form, and Angular makes it interactive. So it makes it interactive in order to handle client-side interactions. So to handle client-side interactions. So HTML presents the form and Angular makes the form interactive. So to handle client-side interactions actually. That means so that user can submit the data, user can modify the data, user can delete the data. You can handle the interaction with the data. Actually, where the interactions are handled, based on that, Angular forms are categorized into two types actually. That means based on where Angular is handling interactions, is based on where Angular is handling interactions. The forms in Angular are classified into two types, two groups actually, classified into two groups. So we have template driven forms. We call them as template driven forms. Template driven forms. And we have model driven forms, or we also call as reactive forms. We have two types of forms in Angular. That means actually in Angular, the forms are classified into two types. They are classified into two types, based on where the interactions are handled. So what does that mean, where the interactions are handled? We have template driven forms, we have model driven forms also. Two types of forms are there. So HTML presents the form, but making the form more interactive. So that means dynamic, that is managed by using Angular. And usually, so template driven forms means, see, actually the concept is nothing but, so we have a login here. So we have a login here, login.component.html, and login.component.ts. So here the entire UI is present, and here the logic is present. For that. Actually, forms can be handled in two locations. Means you can configure the forms. You can configure the form and handle manipulations. You can configure the form. You can handle the manipulations with the form. In this HTML page. That means here in the component, in the TypeScript, there is nothing. Every configuration, every manipulation is managed in HTML. Only that data is submitted here, which it will submit to some other services, which will post to the server-side technologies. That means only data is accessed here. So entire form is configured and handled. All the manipulations of the form are handled in the UI level. That means here in the view level. We know that this is controller level. At the controller level, in the view level, everything is managed. There is nothing about any logic related to form inside this component TS file. All the configurations, all the interactions are managed usually in the UI itself. Then these types of forms are called as template driven. That means creating a control, configuring the name for the control, storing the data for the control. So manipulating the data of that particular control, everything is managed in HTML itself. Then we call these type of forms as template driven forms. Configuring the controls, manipulating the controls, and handling the controls. If everything is managed, only everything is managed in the component level. That means generally we create controls here. So generally we create controls here. We configure the controls here. So we manipulate the controls here. So that means all are managed here. Then we call this as a reactive form. So template driven forms, everything happens in the UI level. And reactive forms, everything happens in the component level. Technically, everything happens here. Now, which one is best? There is nothing like which one is best. It depends on the situation. We have to use both types of forms in an application. So according to the situation and the requirement, we have to switch between template driven and reactive forms or model driven forms. What is actual difference between the forms is important. That means you need, first point, I hope everyone understood clearly, like in the UI, everything is managed. Only the data is submitted to the controller. That is template driven. Creating the controls, configuring the controls, managing data for the controls, everything is done in the UI itself. Those are template driven forms. If only control is present in the UI, its configuration, its data, its implementation, everything is present in the controller. So then it is called reactive form. What is difference actually? That means what is the intention of these two actually? So that means the template driven forms, and template driven forms and the reactive forms. What is difference actually? So what is the intention actually? The main point is template driven form. That means a template driven form configures and handles all interactions at view level. At view level means in HTML page actually. Everything is managed at view level. That means configuration of a form and its manipulation both both handled in HTML template actually. Configuration of the form, manipulation of the form. So what is the role of controller? So actually very optimized controller level interactions. All interactions are at view level. So that means controller level interactions are very reduced. Actually, what is advantage of that? It reduces the number of requests to a component. If it reduces the number of requests to a component, it improves the page load time. Actually. This will improve the page load time. So that means it is good for forms designed in inline technique. You remembered we learned inline technique. Inline technique means so the code and design both are present in one file. If code and design are present in one file, then template driven forms will be better, because already we learned that code and design can be at one. So, but one problem is if everything is in the UI, then what will happen is template driven form is heavy on page. That means it will be slow in handling interactions and rendering. The output, it will be slow, because if everything define in the view, then view becomes very heavy. But obviously it will reduce number of requests because you don't need much interactions in the controller. Everything is managed in the view itself. So that means accessing the data, managing the data, manipulations, everything in the view. But it becomes heavy to the page. Page becomes slow. It will not render fast. And very important is these type of forms are hard to test. Why hard to test? Because hard to test and even extend. Hard to test and extend the form. If you want to extend the form and its functionality, if you want to test, that means here separation issues will come. It is not loosely coupled. So this is one major problem with these template driven forms. Actually, you can use template driven forms when you are designing an interface that doesn't require regular extensions. That means you can use template driven forms. So when you are designing an interface, so you are designing a UI, you can simply say that. When you are designing an user interface that doesn't require regular extensions, For example, we designed a login screen, and a login screen is always same. We don't need much extensions in that. But sometimes we design a registration form. That registration form is not same for everyone. Suppose a person selects his region is India. For him, we need some more fields to add. His region is US. We need to change the form and some more fields into that. That means our form will be regularly changing. Some more features are regularly added. So in that case, this will not be good for such type of forms. If regular extensions are not required, then you can go with that. And very important is the directives that are used to configure the form and form elements in the template driven approach. That means the directives that are used to configure form and form elements. elements, the directives that are used to configure form and form elements in template driven approach. Template driven approach. So we have two important directives. One is ng form is a directive. Another one is ng model is a directive. ng model and ng form are the directive. Actually, ng form, it provides a set of properties and methods that are used to configure and handle the form element actually. That means usually this ng form, usually this ng form, so ng form, actually ng form is a directive. The intention of this directive is nothing but it provides a set of properties and methods. It provides set of properties and methods that are used to configure and handle form element actually. It is used to handle form element. And ng model is actually it provides set of properties and methods. It provides a set of properties and methods. It provides the set of properties and methods that are used to configure and handle a form control like a form control like button, like text box, like check box, like radio, like drop down list, etc. All this. That is what actually ng model is. And very important is the library that is required. So the library for ng form and model, ng form and ng model. The library for ng form ng model is actually Angular/forms library. That is the Angular forms library. So the module is forms module. Already we know this module. We are working with two-way binding from this module. Actually, so how to configure the form and how we can configure the elements in the form and access the elements from the form. That means all the interactions are defined in the UI only. Configuration, interactions, everything is defined in the UI itself. Very less interactions are managed. In the no interactions at all. Only data is managed. Usually data is managed in the controller level. Yeah, validations also here itself. Everything is managed in the UI only. Everything is managed in the UI itself. Usually, how do we configure the form? Actually configuring form. So in a template driven approach, generally how we do is we have a form, and this form can be referred with an hash and a reference name, form name, and is equal to, it makes it as a dynamic form by using ng form. This ng form directive makes this static form into dynamic form, and after making it as a dynamic form, to handle the interactions with the form related all attributes and properties are now accessible by using this reference. This is a reference for this ng form, and the reference is form name, any name for the form with an hash. That is how we define the form, configuring the form. And very important is, after configuring the form, ng form provides several attributes which you can access. That means ng form provides a set of attributes. It will provide several attributes. So many attributes are present in ng form. Actually, ng form provides set of attributes. So many attributes are there, I will tell you. Actually, basic attributes like it will have a value attribute. It will have a pristine attribute. It will have a dirty attribute. It will have a valid attribute. It will have invalid attribute. It will have like errors attribute, errors, so many, etc. So many attributes will be there. So many attributes will be there. These are all the form related attributes. What these attributes are used for, we will see. That's what we are going to discuss. That means form related all options are accessed by using this. Then syntactically, how you define actually is we have to use the form name. So that means form name dot value. We have to use the like form name, form date dot pristine like this. We have to use form name dot dirty like this. And what those are, what is value, what is pristine, what is dirty, I will tell you, we will discuss about that. Initially, this is how we configure a form in a template driven approach. And form related all interactions are managed in the UI itself. Then how you configure a control. So configuring a form element, how you can configure a form element, technically how you can define a form element. Usually to configure the form element, it is simply we have to use ng model. Ng model is used to make define this, how you define this. So we can simply write, suppose input type is equal to text. If I want to make it dynamic, I have to use ng model. Okay, this becomes dynamic. Then, so whatever the manipulation is, it reads a reference name. Some txt name is the reference name. Through this reference name, we can define the ng model. This makes it dynamic and loads all these element related properties into memory, which you can access with reference of txt name. That means txt name can access all the element related properties. And it requires a name, some txt name, because form cannot recognize any element without name. It is mandatory name. This is for identifying the element and this is for accessing its properties. That means through txt name, you can access everything present inside this text box. That means its value, its related all information we can access by using the text box. That is what actually we need to define. That means how we can access that. So we can use like txt name dot value. It will get the value. It will get the value. So we need to configure. So txt name dot valid. It will verify whether it is valid or not. It is satisfying the validation or not. All the properties are configured in this. Right. Now, how to access the data, how to configure the, how to create the template driven forms and how do we work with these template driven forms, that we will see in tomorrow's session. Tomorrow we can start a practical approach in understanding, creating the forms, interacting with the forms and handling validations also, how we can do that. We'll see in tomorrow's session. Okay.